I turn my microphone volume up. Can everybody hear me all right? Great. Okay, I'll speak as loudly as possible. I moved the mic closer to my mouth. So, all right. So thank you all so much for joining us. We're very excited to talk to you today. We're going to try to keep up with questions in the chat box, so please do feel free to put your questions in there. If we don't get to your question or something occurs to you later, we'll have plenty of time for questions at the end as well.
My name is Matt Smith. Just go ahead and say yes if you can hear me in the chat box, just so I can go forward. Awesome. My name is Matt Smith. I'm a collection development specialist at the Kalamazoo Public Library, but before I was in collection development, I was actually a security guard. And in fact, I was a security guard at my library, the library that I work at, which is very relevant to our discussion today about patron bashing, because as a security guard, I, by definition, only deal with the so-called bad patrons, the negative patron behavior. And I've always been a positive, optimistic person, but I even noticed in myself eventually that whenever I would talk about the library to coworkers, to friends, or to family, it was always the latest crazy patron story. So at some point, I realized this was happening to myself, and I was only a security guard for a year, mind you, and I ultimately realized that something was wrong about it. So that made me begin to think a little deeper about the issue of patron bashing. In the meantime, I became a librarian, and I became inspired to give my first talk about patron bashing at a conference. And I'll never forget, from that conference, I had one slide up, and it just said, patrons are ... And I'll never forget the people that were just shouting in the audience these negative things. And, oh, is anybody talking, someone said. Can everyone else hear me besides the one person? Okay, so there's just a couple people who can't. Okay, good. So yeah, from doing my very first presentation on the topic, really just crystallized not only how pervasive this problem is in the library world, but really I became convinced that this is our #1 barrier to excellent customer service at the library.
And I was at MLA when Matt presented. So I actually saw his presentation and I was really struck by it. I also started in libraries relatively young. I started as a student employee at Central Michigan University's library, where I was an anthropology undergraduate in the interlibrary loan department. Shortly thereafter, I became a page at my local public library. I was young and new to the world of libraries and definitely participated in patron bashing to fit in with my colleagues. It was like a badge of honor when I could finally tell my first crazy patron story. Not to mention how fun it was to tell my friends and family all of the unexpected craziness that went on in the library. As I eventually made librarianship my career and grew as a professional, I started to distance myself from talking badly about patrons, but it wasn't until I heard Matt's presentation that it really struck me how harmful patron bashing could be to our profession. So before we go any further, what is patron bashing? What are we talking about? Patron bashing is the kind of thing that you sort of know it when you hear it, and I'd be surprised if some of you didn't have some idea of what I'm talking about. For the sake of this presentation, patron bashing is basically talking badly about our patrons. We discuss 5 different types of patron bashing. The first is venting, and I think this is the most common in all areas of our life. Venting is when, say, something bad happens at the service desk and you're so frustrated, so you go to a colleague at work and you just tell them the whole story in a big emotional way to release all of your feelings in one fell swoop. That's venting. Rumination is when you've had a frustrating interaction with a patron and you just can't seem to let it go. You think about it, you talk about it with coworkers, maybe you even go home and talk to your family or your roommates about it, maybe even your pets. It keeps you up that night. You just keep thinking about it over and over again. You're ruminating about the situation. The third type is storytelling. Storytelling is when you begin to build a narrative around your interactions with patrons. It's what I described earlier about regaling my friends and family members with weird tales from the library. You find yourself collecting examples of how patrons are crazy and libraries are wild places so that you can tell those again as stories. The fourth type of patron bashing is categorizing. Categorizing is deciding that a group of patrons are all similar in some, usually annoying, way. For example, if you work at academic libraries, you might hear about how faculty members are entitled, undergraduates are procrastinators, or about how your undergraduates' parents are overly involved. At a public library, you might categorize mothers who bring in their children to the library, teenagers, or other members of the community. The fifth type of patron bashing is gossiping. Gossiping, of course, is simply talking about people behind their backs. When we gossip about patrons, we're sharing information with our colleagues or with our friends and families that maybe doesn't break our privacy policy, but definitely share some information about our patrons that they may not want to be shared.
So the obvious and I guess the simple answer to our entire talk that we like to kind of get up front is, patron bashing happens because patrons are in fact bad. In other words, we're talking about real experiences that happened, and we're talking to our colleagues about them. We're not making this stuff up. Well, we're here to really call that into question. We're here to call that out. We're here to say that that's not accurate. That is not an objective viewpoint of what's actually going on at libraries, public or academic. We're here to say that 99% of your patrons are just fine. 99% of your patron interactions at the library are just fine. We also are here to put it in that perspective that it needs to be put in. And we're also here not to say that, bad patron interactions don't exist. We think, roughly 1% of your patron interactions are going to be negative or bad. That's the perspective we need to really put it in. And there's only one way to test that. Next time you go out to the service desk, take a sheet of paper with you and have 3 columns. One is positive patron experiences. The second column is going to be negative patron experiences. And the third column is going to be your neutral or blah patron interactions. And if your tally is anywhere like what mine has been when I've done it, you're going to have a significant amount of positive experiences with patrons. You're going to have a small amount of negative patron experiences, or 0 in my case when I did it. And you're going to have a ton of neutral or blah experiences. By definition, they're unmemorable experiences. So that's going to give you, I wish everyone would actually do that. That's going to give you an objective look at what's actually going on in the library. Alternatively, consider the banned patron list, right? Which I love to refer to as like the juiciest library gossip imaginable. How many patrons are you banning in a day? 1, 2, 5, 10, 15 at the most, maybe? I don't know. Now compare that small amount of people who are getting banned by violating the rules of conduct with your entire patron base. It's minuscule. If your numbers are anywhere like my library, we're talking less than 1% of the patron base. So that's what we're here to say. So we're left with sort of this weird paradox where on the one hand, it really does seem that patrons are kind of naughty, right? That's why we talk about them all the time. But on the other hand, we've got the reality of the situation where 99% of patrons are just fine. So we really want to explain why this is happening, and we got a couple big sort of explanations for that. The first one, and this is a big one, it's called negativity bias. So psychology tells us that our memory is built or designed in such a way that we simply remember the negative events that happen to us in any given day. We give them the most amount of weight. We tend not to remember the positive experiences that happened to us that day, or we give them quite a bit less weight than we would do the negative. And then for the neutral, blah experiences, we definitely, our memory could care less about. They are, like I said, by definition, unmemorable, so they don't even register. So that's negativity bias. So when you have a negative experience in the library, you bet that you're going to remember that and take that with you.
Similar to negativity bias, we have confirmation bias. Confirmation bias happens in social sciences when social scientists are trying to prove or disprove a hypothesis. When they have this hypothesis in place, this idea of what they think is happening, they tend to notice the behaviors and examples of things that support their hypothesis with greater weight than they tend to notice the things that don't happen to support their hypothesis. We also tend to do this quite a bit in our personal lives. Dr. John Gottman is a researcher in marriage and relationships, and his research shows that when you believe that your partner loves you and wants to make you happy, you tend to notice the things that they do for you, the things that they say and do that make you feel loved, and you tend to not notice the things they do that annoy you. If you believe your partner maybe doesn't love you or might not have your best interest at heart, you tend to notice the things they do that annoy you, the missed opportunities, the times they didn't tell you that they loved you. And then those stories tend to feed into themselves, right? So if all you're noticing are the nice things your partner is doing, that feeds into the narrative that you're telling yourself that your partner loves you and has your best interests at heart. So when we believe that our patrons are rude or undergraduates are immature, we tend to notice the events that fit into those narratives and disregard the events that run opposite to them.
All right, sorry, I forgot to. Negativity bias, I forgot to say, there's a really good reason we have this. It's an evolutionary survival tool. That's why our memory is designed this way. It has survival value. It makes sense that we would remember our cousin was eaten by a lion rather than to remember our cousin was not eaten by a gazelle. So there's good reason we have negativity bias. It just is unfortunate in this situation with patron bashing. Another big explanation that explains patron bashing is groupthink. Groupthink, well-founded phenomenon and flaw that comes to us from sociology that, of course, studies how people interact in groups. And it goes like this. It's pretty simple. I start patron bashing to Samantha, and she hears it, and then she starts patron bashing to her other colleague, and they just kind of go with the flow. And then next thing you know, this kind of a thing spreads to the culture and the work environment like wildfire. Groupthink is just predicated on the idea that people don't want to go against the grain. People don't generally want to speak up and say, you know, Matt, maybe we should not be doing this. Maybe this is wrong. Another big explanation, so racism is and classism is one of those things that are institutional, cultural, in the air we breathe, so to speak. So Samantha and I were not surprised that it kind of reared its head in this patron bashing phenomenon. And patron bashing reminds us of racism in two very specific ways. So the first one is racism is fueled by its false narratives and stereotypes about a group of people, right? That's what pushes it forward. That's what gives it its wings or its life. And it's the same thing with patron bashing. We've got these untrue, negative stereotypes about a group of people. In this case, it's patrons, and that's what fuels and propagates the patron bashing phenomenon. So that's number one. That's a more indirect way it reminds us of racism. The second way is much more direct, And that's just frankly that sometimes patron bashing simply is a form of racism. In other words, sometimes patron bashing is just a convenient or coded way to talk about people of color without saying it directly. And if you don't believe me, you can go to Google right now and just type in the word crazy library patrons, and I already did it, obviously. And one of the first websites that comes up, I think it's top 5 in the results screen, was this lovely little blog by a young, pretty white librarian. And essentially, within 5 minutes of perusing the blog, I noticed that the negative racial epithets and stereotypes were pretty thick. In other words, it was a person talking smack about patrons, but in reality, they were talking about black people. It's the kind of racism that's shrouded in this coded language that we talk about, right? So I'm not racist, but I just really hate Medea, or I like black people, but I just think urban fiction is the most ridiculous thing, and it's corrupting the youth, stuff like that. Go for it. Should work.
Okay. Can everybody hear me? Excellent. Great. Okay. So when I heard Matt's original presentation, it was at this point that I thought, okay, wait a minute. I patron bash, sure, but I'm not a bad person. I love my patrons. I love my work. I just need to vent to let off some steam. Working in libraries are stressful. We all have to vent. And this idea, the idea that venting is healthy, is what led Matt and I to do this research. The first thing we wanted to find out was, where does the idea of venting as a coping mechanism come from? The idea that we have to let off steam to be healthy comes from the hydraulic model of anger. This model of anger was first put forth by Aristotle and perpetuated by ancient Greeks. It's the idea that our psyche, our emotions, are basically a set of closed pipes. As our emotions are agitated by the events of our day, the pipes fill with steam. If we don't safely let off the steam through venting or other catharsis, our pipes will burst. This idea was embraced by the ancient Greeks, who believed it was healthy to participate in or even just watch violent sporting events in order to release pent-up emotions. The model was further popularized by Freud, and we still see it all around us. This is an actual billboard in Missouri. It encourages people to hit a pillow or a wall instead of hitting their children. There's also quite an industry around anti-stress devices like this Wham-It punching bag. I bet if you look around your office right now, you're likely to see one or more free squeezy balls or other items designed to help you let off some steam and vent your frustrations. But do these items work? Are we actually healthier for letting off steam and venting?
So what Samantha and I really want to do with this whole patron bashing concept was to really dig down into the research, to really ask the question about what did science, specifically psychology, have to say about it. We didn't want to be the people that, come in front of people and talk to them about basically our opinions and our feelings on the issue. We wanted a legitimate research component to this issue, which it deserves. So that was our research project. Does venting and does rumination have any possible psychological benefits? And in full disclosure, we came into it open-minded. We thought that there easily could be positive benefits to venting. One of which we thought could be kinship, friendship, team building, stuff like that, which made sense to us before we did the research. So you could probably already tell just by going through just a little snapshot of some of the articles that in the case of venting and rumination, psychology is unanimous which you don't see a lot in science. And it's unanimous that venting and rumination is not only bad for the person you are ruminating against, that's pretty obvious, right? It's not only bad for your own psychological well-being, that's a little less obvious, but it's also bad for your co-workers, the people you're venting with, which the literature calls co-ruminators. And not only that, it's bad for what we would consider innocent bystanders, and I'll explain that in a little bit. In other words, people who had nothing to do with the original situation at all. So we want to give you just a little flavor of what some of these experiments actually looked like, because they fall into certain categories. Experiment number 1 is the pounding the nails experiment. So they'd have the subjects of the experiment, probably college students, they would provoke them in some way. All the experiments start with this provocation. It's like an annoyance. It's something that would get them upset, right? So think of you're at the library and you're upset by a patron, right? That's the provocation. And then the second part of the experiment, in this one, they would have the students pound nails. So you can think of physical aggression as like a proxy for venting, which seems commonsensical for a lot of people. Or you can think of punching a punching bag, those types of experiments. So that's the venting. And then, of course, it's an experiment, so it has a control group. So you'd have a group that essentially does nothing, right? Doesn't pound nails, doesn't punch a punching bag. And then, of course, the final part of the experiment is the results, right? What happened? Who was better off? Who was worse off? You probably already know the results. The people who pounded the nails were worse off for their psychological well-being. Their anger sort of amplified. It stayed with them, sort of. And they were much more negative when they thought about the original experience compared to the control group, which did nothing, in which a lot of these experiments actually found that 10 minutes was all that was needed to essentially dissipate the anger from the original experience. Now this one is the angry professor experiment, and this one is a lot more close to home with our profession of being librarians. So the first part, you imagine you're a student, you're a subject in the experiment, you write this beautiful essay, paper, and the professor just tears it apart. You get bad marks on everything. It makes you angry. So that's the provocation. The second part would be the venting stage, where they had a group of these subjects write about their feelings. What do they feel about the professor? What do they feel about how the professor ripped up their paper? So they would vent in that way. And then they had the control group write about unicorns or pink ponies or something like that. And then this experiment was pretty fascinating. So not surprisingly, the people who did ruminate were much worse off, like the other experiment, for their own psychological well-being, and they were much more negative towards the professor afterward. And by afterward, we're talking they do the experiment, they go home, they sleep for 8 hours, they come back to the experiment, and then they're asked to rate the professor. So the people who vented were very subjective about how they rated the professor. In other words, they rated him much, much worse than the control group, who were much better off for their psychology, and they gave the professor more objective type ratings. So the experiments get much worse, and this is where we start talking about how rumination and venting can essentially affect innocent bystanders. So a typical example would be you go to work, your boss yells at you, you ruminate it, so you ruminate about it with your coworkers for a while, and then you go home and your partner or roommate has dishes piled up on the side of and you completely blow up on your partner or roommate in a disproportional way. That's kind of the key word, because it's obviously annoying for anyone to have that have dishes piled up or whatever, but it's the disproportionate nature that makes it an innocent bystander situation. And these experiments were fairly simple, so the provocation, of course, happens first. These people would be angered at the beginning of the experiment. Then they would have, of course, a group ruminate about that, and then they would have the control group who did not ruminate about that. And then in a lot of these experiments, they would go home, sleep on it, come back to the experiment the next day. And one example was they would have the next have what they called like a minor annoyance. So they'd be walking down a hall and a person that's working the experiment would like bump into their shoulder or something like that. So it's a minor annoyance. And then they would measure the reaction. So the people who ruminated essentially blew up on the person in a disproportional way. Then the control group who didn't ruminate, who just saw it as a minor annoyance, the way that you should see it. So to take a library example is you have a legitimate bad patron experience, you vent about it, you go home, you sleep, you come back into the work the next morning. Mother brings her child in the library, they're loud, they have Cheetos, whatever, a minor annoyance, and you blow up. You take it all out on a person who had nothing to do with the original experience. So if you're just outright skeptical about two librarians reading psychological research and reporting back to you, you don't really have to take our word for it. One of the experts in the field of venting and ruminating, his name is Brad Bushman. We relied on some of his work for our research, but just for the heck of it, we emailed him one day, just kind of out of the blue. We said, hey, there's this patron bashing phenomenon. What do you think about it? Do you think that there's some benefits, etc.? And he replied pretty immediately, and he said, and I quote, that patron bashing will only fuel the flames.
Based on this research, we would like to propose a new model to replace the hydraulic model of anger. Instead of our emotions being like steam trapped in a closed system, it's really more like an open pot of water on the stove. If you turn the heat on under the pot, the water begins to heat up and eventually will boil until it's creating steam. But if you turn the heat off and just leave the pot there, eventually the steam dissipates, the bubbles settle down, and the water returns to the state it was in before it heated up. In the studies Matt just described, the participants who were not asked to vent or ruminate, who just went on with their lives or wrote about something other than the event that triggered their emotions, found that their anger dissipated in as little as 10 minutes. Compare that to the 8 hours of anger that the participants who ruminated experienced. 8 hours is a whole shift at work. It's a ruined evening at home with your family. It's a restless night's sleep. Our emotions, even when they're very intense ones like anger can be, do eventually go away. Our emotions are temporary. By doing nothing, we can actually calm down from a frustrating interaction more quickly than by venting. However, doing nothing can be way trickier than it sounds, and I think we all know that. So there are some techniques you can do to try to help calm yourself without turning to venting or rumination. It can be helpful to focus on something else at work, maybe a project that's going well or that's really absorbing, or a pleasant conversation with a coworker. Another way to let your anger evaporate is called cognitive reappraisal. Cognitive reappraisal is a practice that involves changing the context of an emotionally charged situation to help lessen the intensity of your emotional reaction. For example, maybe you're working at the service desk in your library and you tell a patron they can't check out any books because they have too many fines on their account, and they yell at you, they react really poorly. Without even knowing it, you start to make up a story in your mind about why the patron acted that way. Cognitive reappraisal lets you change that story. So maybe that happens and you start to think, oh, this patron is such a jerk because they yelled at me about something that's not even my fault. But instead, you could think, wow, maybe that patron is having a terrible day. Maybe they overdrew their checking account, and they don't have any money to pay their fines, and they're embarrassed, and that's why they yelled. The great thing about cognitive reappraisal is that it doesn't even matter if it's true. You don't know which of those stories are true, but by believing the kinder version, it helps to calm you and lessen your emotional reaction. Sometimes it is necessary to tell our coworkers about a negative interaction you've had with a patron. In order to keep those conversations from verging into venting, it's helpful to ask yourself what the goal is in sharing this story. Is this a constructive conversation? Do you want to make sure your coworker is prepared in case the person comes back? Do you want to make sure you handled the situation appropriately? Or if not one of those things, maybe you are just venting. If you feel that you do have a goal to your story, you want to make sure that you're using constructive language to describe the situation and not verging into name calling or talking negatively about the patron as you describe that interaction.
So let's switch gears and turn to the beautiful, moral, quasi-religious life philosophy of Stoicism, which of course was started by the ancient Greek Epictetus, of course, and later popularized by the Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius in the beautiful book called Meditations. So this whole patron bashing phenomenon reminds me of Stoicism in two specific ways, which I really do think is consistent with the research of how to act. So we're talking about how to deal with, legitimate, difficult patron interactions in the moment or before the moment happens as like a preparation or after. Stoicism has two fundamental principles. Number one, it's the control of our emotions with our mind. There is a lot of truth to that. So the perfect Stoic would be in a negative patron interaction and not really feel the negative emotions of anger. Maybe their heart wouldn't race, they wouldn't start sweating. But that might be too much to ask. I think we're human beings, of course. But the next best step to being a good Stoic is you work on that emotion immediately. During when it's happened, you try to keep calm, and afterwards, you try to keep that negative emotion in check. And Stoicism sometimes gets a bad rap by being like emotionless, like the person who doesn't cry at a funeral or something like that. But really it just means trying to control our negative emotions and then enjoying all of the great emotions about being a human being. So if you have a great positive interaction on the reference desk, you embrace that and you go with it. There is nothing wrong with that. That is the benefit of being open and not closed off when we're working. So become a Stoic. Number two, Stoicism says that it is irrational to worry about things that are not within our control, which makes a lot of sense here, especially when you consider patrons come into the library with just so many different things. Their parents, they're upgrading, their schooling, their education, poverty or not. There is so many things that make a person who they are. And not only their whole life, but that day. What kind of a day did they have before they talked to you? None of those things are in our control. We have no control over them. So it's irrational to really worry too much about that. So I think Stoicism helps in those two respects when it comes to excellent customer service. Taking maybe a more, religious approach to patron bashing, I like to think of myself sometimes when I, again, am dealing with those difficult patron interactions as a sin eater. Apparently the concept of sin eater goes way back to early forms of religion where a person in the community had such bad sins that they couldn't go through the traditional religious means of absolving those sins, so they'd have to find some sin eater, like hiding out in the mountains or something like that. So I like to think of myself when I am dealing with a negative interaction, I really do like to think of myself as eating this person's sins, as just taking them on, because I just feel like I happen to be in a privileged position to do that. So why not? Why not forgive? It makes it better for everyone.
You may have heard of Brene Brown. She's a researcher and author who has some great TED Talks. In her latest book, she talks about this statement: people are doing the best they can. Someone said this to her, that people were doing the best they could, and at first she flat out did not believe it. She thought people could always do better. They could always try harder. So she started polling the people in her life to see whether or not they believed that people are, on any given day, with what they have, doing the best they can. What she found is that the people who believed that, yes, people are doing the best they can, tended to be more empathetic. They were able to be empathetic because by believing that people are doing the best they can, you meet people where they are instead of where you wish they were. This is an interesting question to ask ourselves. Do we believe that our patrons are doing the best they can? And to step outside of libraries for a minute, I think this is an interesting question to ask ourselves in traffic, because I know that while I typically do believe that, yes, people are doing the best they can, I tend to forget that when I see somebody driving in a way that I think is not great, that I think they could drive better. But then the very next day, I will do something boneheaded in traffic, and I find myself not doing the best that I can. But the trick is that if you believe that people are doing the best they can, it puts you in a place to offer forgiveness, which is similar to what Matt was talking about with the sin eater. In our traffic example, sometimes you're the one getting cut off, and sometimes you're the one cutting other people off. And so if you can remember that you often fail or fall short of the mark, even when you're trying to do your best, so do other people, and you can offer them that forgiveness. What's interesting about this concept is that Brene Brown also found that people who believed that other people were doing the best they can also tended to have strong boundaries that went along with their strong empathy. Matt and I get asked a lot when we do this presentation if we mean that patrons can just do whatever they want in the library if we're saying we can't talk badly about them, and that's of course not the case. I do believe patrons are doing the best they can, but sometimes, for some reason, their best is not going to fit in with the library's policies. We do have our boundaries that are necessary to create a safe space for patrons and to protect the library's collections and be good stewards of our resources. However, by being empathetic to our patrons, even when we enforce the rules, means we don't have to take it personally when they break the rules, and we don't have to make a judgment about their character, just about their actions. We can be forgiving to them, even in a time when we have to ask them to maybe leave the library or stop doing something that they're doing. And the great news about empathy is that it can be learned. Empathy, the more you practice it, the easier it becomes to do so. So that even if you're not totally sure that people are doing the best they can, you can try approaching the world in that way and find that empathy gets easier and easier. How we feel about our patrons is important because, as we've discussed, venting and ruminating about negative interactions is bad for our emotional health and bad for our patrons. It's also important because of the amount of emotional labor we do at our jobs. Now, I think we've all felt like Captain Kirk here at some point, but we often expect ourselves to act like Mr. Spock, like we don't have emotions or that we're in control of our emotions at all times. And in fact, Star Trek references aside, the reality is even a little bit weirder. These are the RUSA guidelines for behavioral performance of reference and information service providers, and I'm sure we've all seen them echoed in any customer service initiative that we've tried to put forward. We expect ourselves to be friendly, to make eye contact, to have open body language. And this, of course, represents a very narrow spectrum of human emotions. When you don't happen to be feeling somewhere in that narrow spectrum of friendly, open, and good eye contact and smiles, and you have to make yourself act that way, you're doing something known as emotional labor. We've all come home from a day at the service desk feeling exhausted when maybe we can't think of all that much that we did, and part of the reason why is this emotional labor. Part of the reason we vent, ruminate, gossip, and bash our patrons is one way of trying to cope with the effort that emotional labor puts on us throughout the day. But I argue that those coping mechanisms actually make our work harder. By being smiling, friendly people at the service desk, turning around, going into the staff area, and calling our patrons names or telling our coworkers yet another story about the annoying people we deal with every day, and then turning back around, slapping a smile on our faces to try to be friendly at the service desk again, we're creating more emotional labor, maybe even a roller coaster of emotional labor. If we can be empathetic to our patrons at all times and avoid patron bashing behavior, we are able to offer a more holistic version of customer service. We can also offer a more holistic customer service by creating an empathetic culture within our organizations. Cheryl Gould wrote an excellent article about facilitative customer service, in which she notes that the people in our organizations with the least amount of power tend to be the ones with the most face time with our patrons. We're talking about our student employees, our library pages. This means that people at the lower levels of our organization also tend to be the most risk for patron bashing, because not only do they interact with patrons the most, but they're doing the highest amount of emotional labor. And as Matt and I mentioned earlier, they're new to the organization often. They're looking for ways to fit in, and they're looking to others within the organization to tell them what that culture is. Telling their new crazy patron story is a great way to do it. They soak up the culture of the organization, and then they reflect it back to our patrons. By being empathetic to those at the lower level of our organizations, by eliminating patron bashing with our coworkers, we can lower our emotional labor and improve customer service through a holistic approach.
So just to sum up, we first talked about kind of where we were coming from in our background. I talked about how I was a security guard at my library and how that inspired me to start thinking about the phenomenon in a little more detail.
We talked about what patron bashing is: venting, rumination, storytelling, categorizing.
We emphasized the fact that we believe 99% of patrons are just fine, and 1% of patrons will have the difficult experiences. So we asked the question, why then does patron bashing exist? Number one was negativity bias.
Number two was confirmation bias.
Then we talked about how groupthink can spread it into a workplace culture, and then we talked about how it reminded us of racism and classism.
We talked about the myth of the hydraulic model of anger and how it's not actually very effective.
We talked about what does science have to say about patron bashing. We went over some of the experiments, and we learned that science was unanimous that patron bashing was not good for all parties involved.
Based on our research, we offered a new model, one in which anger evaporates and our emotions are temporary.
We talked about becoming a stoic and becoming a sin eater.
We talked about having empathy for our patrons, how that actually can lessen our emotional labor and allow us to offer better customer service. What Matt and I have really found, what's been the most impressed upon us as we've done this research, is how much of a choice we have about our day and our work. We can choose how we cope with the stress of our jobs. We can choose how we treat our patrons and treat them with empathy, and we can choose to change our culture. Thank you so much. That is the end of our presentation. We'd be happy to take questions or discussion in the chat box.
Looks like we got at least 17 minutes, so we always very much appreciate questions. Good, bad, positive, skeptical. We love any types of questions about whatever you heard. Or just in general, what the culture is like in your library. Or do you think we're off the mark when it comes to how bad patron bashing is as a phenomenon? Oh, whoa. We'll start at the top. How big is this? So how big of a thing do you think patron bashing is? Good question. How common is it? That's a good question. I think it's very big of a thing. I think it is, as our subtitle of our program is, it is killing the spirit. Let me go back. It's killing the spirit of our libraries, especially when it comes to customer service. I think that's what I tend to focus on, is how it impacts customer service. And I'm not talking about just interactions with real human beings at the public service desk. It affects policies, procedures at the highest level. It is a worldview that we take on, and it affects everything. So I think it's a big thing. And then once you really start thinking about patron bashing, you become hypersensitive to it. So you just notice every single time it happens in every day. So every day I go to my public library in Kalamazoo, and I hear it multiple times a day from my coworkers. So yeah, I think it's a big thing.
I've noticed a few questions about what to do if someone is bashing to you or if you're witnessing patron bashing, and how to sort of react in an empathetic way. And I'm really glad that somebody said that, how to be an empathetic listener, because a point that I'd like to make is, as Matt said, you sort of become hyper aware of it, and I'm guilty sometimes of feeling like, well, I'm above it and I've strategized this out of my life. But what's important to remember is that slide about people are doing the best they can. That's true of everybody in that situation. So our patrons are doing the best they can, our colleagues are doing the best they can, and we're doing the best we can. And any and all of us may be in a position to need some forgiveness or some empathy in that situation. And so if I've had if I've had colleagues or coworkers, venting about a patron to me, I just try to listen to them in that moment and tell them that I'm really sorry that that happened to them. And all I'm responsible for in that situation is my actions, and making sure that I'm not fueling the flame, that I don't say like, oh yeah, well you should hear what happened to me, and tell them a bad thing that happened to me. So certainly sometimes people are going to vent to us, and I know I still vent sometimes, even though I've read the research, but it's about being there for people and letting them vent if that's what they're doing. And just, I will tell you, a bad strategy in that situation is to tell them about the research of venting. Nobody is going to appreciate that in the moment. So when somebody's feeling emotionally charged, just listening empathetically and just not letting it become part of that culture and not participating in it yourself, and not asking them for like updates. If you see that same patron again, I've noticed that as a common practice. There's like one patron that is problematic, and so when you see him leave, you're like, ooh, how did that go? So if somebody's venting to you or you hear patron bashing going on around you, just being empathetic to the person who's doing it without escalating the situation yourself.
Yeah, I don't have much to add to that. I just think there's a way of refraining from patron. First of all, just refraining itself is a huge step. That is your choice as a person to not do it, but there is a non-judgmental way to do that, and then there's like a snobby, judgmental way to do that. And your coworkers are smart; they're going to know what approach you're taking. So that's the key, is to do it with compassion, so everyone knows what page you're on. People in my work environment, they know where I stand on this. I very occasionally do vent sometimes, or just tell a story, but I mean far less than I ever did it before. So yeah, non-judgmental. Here's a good question. I think that was at the top. I'm fascinated by the research findings. I actually didn't realize there was so much kind of evidence that venting is counterproductive. Either did we. Like, we were absolutely kind of blown away by how the field of psychology was like so against it, which goes so against culture. Just says that venting is good for you. That's in our, you'd call that pop psychology, right? Pop psychology says venting is good for you. Everyone says it. It just seems so intuitive. In fact, it is not.
I saw one question about doing this sort of a practice or a presentation with student employees and when they're just starting, and I have not done that myself. And the question went on to say something about how do you tell them this while preparing them for how bad patrons are, I think, if I'm getting that wording correct. And I would argue that what's most important in those situations is to reflect on the boundaries that you're asking your student employees. So instead of, if you want to prepare them, because I assume, and please correct me if I'm wrong, questioner, by saying how do you prepare them for how bad patrons are, you want to prepare students to protect the library spaces and protect the library's collections and do the job that's necessary of them in following the library's rules and enforcing the library's rules. And so that's where I like to look on the library's rules as really our boundaries when we're talking about empathy. So we have rules in place not because we want to be mean to our patrons. Oh, thank you. Oh, without suggesting patrons are bad. Thank you. I'm glad you clarified that. You can suggest, that's a really great question. Well, I think first and foremost, there is a certain element of customer bashing in all areas. So if you have student employees who maybe have been servers before or baristas, they have probably participated in a certain amount of like customer bashing behind the scenes. So I think that you wouldn't necessarily have to introduce the idea that patrons are bad. You could just talk about being empathetic to patrons. I want to give it a little more thought. Matt, do you have any other thoughts?
Yeah, just it's all in the way. To me, it's all in the way you say things. Like, you can get a employee and be like, yeah, someone pooped on the wall. I hate bringing up that example. And just the way you talk about it says so much about, like, it connotes that this is happening all the time, whereas I would just say sometimes people get drunk at the library. Sometimes people get, irate at the library and they cross boundaries. Sometimes people poop on the walls. That happens very rarely. That's how I would always put it to, if I was training someone. This rarely happens, or we love to talk about stolen books, like it's happening, like it's happening every second of the day. So I would say, yeah, people steal books. It very rarely happens in the grand scheme of things. It's about, to me, it's about always reinforcing perspective.
Yes, and to go along with that, the question about, really quickly, I wanted to hit on the question that was earlier about, have we noticed any difference between academic and public? I've worked in both academic and public. I anecdotally have not noticed any difference. We have not studied in any way. Our study, of course, focused a lot on the venting and the psychology about that. We haven't necessarily observed at academic libraries and public libraries in any sort of systematic way, but I have anecdotally observed it at both, having worked, I think, about equally in public and academic throughout my career. There was one question. Oh, how do you communicate with library staff about patrons who are abusive, trespass, make racist comments to student workers, etc.? There are certainly times where you do have to share information. So part of my role, I'm one of the operations and user services managers, which in our department, in our library, deals with a lot of access services and operational concerns. And part of my role is keeping track of the banned patrons, which is why, as Matt said, sometimes it's nice to do that math and find out that less than 1% of our patrons who use our library have ever been banned. But it does fall to me to communicate with other staff in the library about those patrons who have been banned, and to write our incident reports and to monitor the other incident reports that are written by other staff. And some of the practices I've put in place, especially to make sure we're not veering into a racist mindset, is I'm very careful. We don't include a lot of demographic information in our incident reports unless it's absolutely crucial to the situation. If we have to find that patron again or be on the lookout for a specific person, then we might include some demographic information. But otherwise, there may not be necessarily any point in having somebody's gender or race included. So that's one way. Again, like Matt said, it's all about the perspective, and it's all about, you're talking about somebody's behavior and not about somebody's character. So in the incident reports or in communicating with other staff, you're not saying, that there's this terrible person who's walking around who's dangerous. You just talk about the behavior that's maybe been concerning, and how to, that it has breached those boundaries that we have put in place as a library, and so therefore these are the actions that need to be taken.
Yeah. I'll just add, there's a pretty obvious line between informational talking and gossiping, and I think we all know what the difference is. These are our rules. This is how we document this behavior. This is how the ban process works. That's really it. That's the professional way to deal with that. There's a question about, have you started trying to implement this new model in your organizations? I'll just add a sort of a personal success story at my library, and this just has to do with once you model this type of behavior in an empathetic way, this is one thing that could happen. It might not happen for you, but I had a coworker, her name was Ruth. She was kind of like my suite mate. We were right next to each other. She was pretty adamant in a respectful way. We had a bunch of debates about this, that bashing, venting was a good thing. Like I said, we had a lot of arguments. She said, and she always used the word, it lifts me up. Someone, a patron beats me down, and my friends, colleagues, they lift me up. And she just kept saying that phrase, and I was just like, all I can say is about the research says it's not good for you. So, that went on for, months or whatever. And then finally, just one day, she went up to me one morning and she's like, you know what, Matt, I've really been thinking about this venting thing, and I really do agree it's not good for me. And I've had many of those little kind of victories in my organization. It's not like we've changed the entire culture and it doesn't happen, but I do think it spreads slowly like that. So yeah, that's all. So.
The only other suggestions I would have, and this is something I'm just at the beginning of thinking about with some of our staff, is if you're in a managerial position, first of all recognize that you have an incredible amount of influence over the culture around you, even if it doesn't always feel that way. And your positivity or negativity, I believe, can really impact how other people view the world around them and the things that happen. You can also, things like empathy and emotional intelligence can be learned. And so providing any training opportunities in those areas can really help people do those types of activities like cognitive reappraisal, which involve recognizing that you're feeling a way, deciding that you want to either go with that emotion or try to redirect it. And I mean, that's a small thing, but that can be a big thing. The other question I wanted to address was, have you reflected on workplace cultures that are peppered with negativity between professional peers? And do you feel patron bashing fits into that dynamic either in a causal or corollary way? Great question. I have not done any research except to say that in Cheryl Gould's facilitative customer service, she talks a lot about how what goes on within an organization comes out of that organization. And also in the emotional labor research that I've read, there's actually more emotional labor that goes on between coworkers rather than customers, which makes sense if you think about it, because you spend all day trying to quote unquote act professional with your colleagues. And that can be, there's more of a relationship there often with customers, so that can be challenging. So I would guess, without having done much research, that based on those two bits of knowledge, that patron bashing definitely fits into a dynamic where there's more negativity and bashing between peers. Also because I think it's a learned behavior, and I think that empathy is also learned. And so the more you're being empathetic towards your patrons, the more you may be empathetic towards your peers and vice versa. So the more empathy there is, I tend to believe will help on both planes.
Yeah, I think negativity is I think it's the key word here. And I think this sort of thing is just a subset of just negativity in general. And that's a human nature question, I guess, is that sometimes it's a little bit easier to be a negative, but it's not, that doesn't make it good for you. It doesn't make it the right thing to do. A lot of people, thanks, a lot of really good, just positive comments about the presentation. Appreciate that. And then I'm almost positive the recording will be made available. I think Eloise said that. So it should be free access. This recording I'll present to my staff. Thank you. This is great. There's a difference between debriefing and bashing, but everyone might not be able to distinguish this difference. Yeah, the debriefing word really reminds me of what Samantha called cognitive reappraisal. Does that sound right, Samantha? Yeah. It's dealing with it in a totally different positive way, and bashing is the negative way to deal with it.
I saw a question about patron bashing by people who aren't in user services and maybe don't operate with patrons directly. That definitely can happen. I think we all have opinions about the people we work with or work for, and I think that definitely has an impact on how we view our work, whether we believe that the people we're working for, in our case in an academic library, maybe if you're in tech services, you might not have much face-to-face with a patron, but the work you're doing is for patrons. And so it's really important that I think we all, in every department, examine our belief about the people that we're working for. So I think that's a really good point, and thank you. And I do think it happens in all levels of library. I think it's a weird library culture thing. Like I said, it happens outside of libraries, but I've definitely witnessed it throughout, which is very interesting.
So comment from, Amy, our library has lost thousands of dollars in stolen books. Point taken. I mean, I obviously believe you, but you have to always compare that. Well, one, compare that with other libraries. How do you stack up with other libraries? Is it significantly different from other libraries? Second number to compare it with is the thousands of dollars you spend on books. How many books are in your collection? Multiply that by the average price, you know what I mean? So again, I think it is a perspective thing. every organization, store, business has to deal with theft because we're human beings, and some human beings steal books for whatever reason. But point taken. Oh yeah. Okay. Well, it is 2 o'clock. We really appreciate talking about patron bashing. We appreciate how many participants were at this talk. Thanks so much for having us. And our emails are right there. Please don't hesitate to email either me or Samantha. And thank you very much.
Thank you all. Have a great day.